Well, I will call this council workshop to order for Monday, July 15th at 7 o'clock. Council, we have an agenda that's been circulated. Any errors or omissions? Hearing none, moved by Councillor Muri. Is there a seconder on the matter? Seconded by Councillor Ma. Call the question. All in favor? Contrary minded, motion carries. There's two sets of minutes that are included with the package. Are there any errors or omissions from those minutes as presented? Hearing none, moved by Councillor Muri. Is there a seconder on that? Councillor Hanson. Prepared to call the question. All in favor? Contrary minded, motion carries. Thank you very much. Moving on to reports from council or staff, official community plan update. Mr. Melbourne.
Thanks very much, Your Worship, members of council, members of the community in attendance. Good evening, Your Worship, members of council. With me tonight is Mr. Jason Smith, senior planner in our community planning department. He'll be providing the presentation, and of course, Tina Atha, our director of planning, community planning, and housing, will also be available to answer questions. So Mr. Smith will be providing a presentation to council about provincially mandated official community plan amendments. His presentation tonight will focus on the necessary scope and timelines to update the OCP, or official community plan, as I'll refer to it. That's for the benefit of folks watching at home. As required by Bill 44, approved in the fall of 2023. Specifically, the district must, by December 31st of next year, so the end of 2025, provide for at least the 20-year total number of housing units required to meet anticipated housing needs. And Mr. Smith will get into more detail. So I just want to say, I don't want to leave any doubt in council's mind tonight as you hear the presentation and we go through the conversation, that this is a significant effort of the organization and staff, working with consultants, working with the community, in a significant conversation. And a particular focus will be needed in order for us to achieve the task and the timeline given to us. Staff are therefore presenting the anticipated scope and timelines for this OCP review to help guide and shape the community's development in the coming decades. And we look forward to providing the presentation tonight and responding to council's questions and receiving feedback. Thank you.
Thank you for the opportunity to present the proposed scope for the OCP official community plan update. As Mr. Milburn alluded to, the province has recently made some significant changes to the Local Government Act, particularly as it relates to land use regulation and planning in the province. And those changes are driving this OCP update. Some of the ones I would like to highlight that Mr. Milburn spoke to, one is the requirement by the end of this year to update the district's housing needs report to outline a 20-year housing need. And then subsequent to that, as was mentioned, there's now a requirement that the district update its OCP and zoning bylaws to accommodate that 20-year housing need. The province also introduced the concept of transit-oriented areas that to exist in the district, and I'll speak to that later. And those prescribed minimum allowable densities and heights. And then finally, the province also introduced a series of new tools to help local governments realize amenities through new development. And two of those particular tools I'd like to highlight here. One was the introduction of inclusionary zoning as a means to require affordable housing in new development. In addition, the province also updated the density bonusing tool to make it more effective. And we will look to implement some of those as part of this project. This timeline that presents here is some of the existing policy and direction that are also shaping this OCP update, namely the official community plan itself, which was adopted in 2011. Just more recently, the OCP action plan, which was a targeted review of the OCP and to help ensure that it would see the district through to 2030. Last year at this time, we updated the housing needs report with the latest census data, and we will be doing that again this fall. And then in response to the bills that were passed in late 2023 and this spring, Council on June 17th adopted a transit-oriented area designation bylaw and also increased the ability to do infill development in the district as well. The 2011 official community plan introduced a very strong vision and urban structure for the district, and namely that 75 to 90% of new housing be directed towards 4 key centers: Lynn Valley, Lynn Creek, Lionsgate, and Maplewood, and that growth be connected by transit. This, during the OCP action plan, which is a targeted review that focused on 4 key topics: housing, transportation, the economy, and responding to the climate emergency through a social equity lens, reaffirmed that vision and structure and felt council at the time in adopting the OCP action plan felt that that vision and structure would continue to serve the district well through 2030. As Mr. Milburn alluded to, we have some very tight timelines that the legislation requires us to meet, December 2025, and some certain requirements that we also need to address through this process. And so staff have assessed the available resources we have and identified 7 focus areas that we'd like to target this OCP update on. I'd like to just allude to what those are right now. The first is to accommodate the 20-year housing need. As mentioned, that's a legislative requirement. And what this table here shows that when the OCP was adopted, it estimated that there would be a demand over the 20-year time period of that OCP in 2011 for 10,000 additional units and allocated it to the urban structure. And that's what you see here in the lighter bars, how that 10,000 units would be allocated or the vision to allocate those units. And one thing that kind of stands out is the outside centers was actually a range. It was 1,000 to 1,200 units. So all the growth we've seen here has been kind of aligned with the vision and the urban structure that was outlined in the 2011 OCP. About 80% of our growth has arrived, been approved or built in our 4 key centers. So moving forward, scope would see that we would build and enhance and look to build on that urban structure that was adopted in 2011. And so as I was mentioning, where are we going to locate the growth? We have this urban structure in place, a series of centers connected through transit. So some of the possibilities with public and council input on where to locate that residential growth will be a key focus for the conversation of the OCP update. More growth in centers. Should we consider expanding some of our centers? Start looking at expanding corridors where we have transit, perhaps selective increases in infill development in certain neighborhoods in the community. All can be part of the conversation with council's direction as part of this process. The province also identified 2 transit-oriented areas, TOAs, in the district, Phibbs Exchange and Capilano University Exchange, with the prescribed densities and heights that you see on the slide. Some consideration and refinement of how to bring that concept into our larger land use policy framework will need to be considered so that it aligns with our plans and local needs. Again, rapid transit is critical for housing growth and residential growth to function in the district. And this plan will need to consider the arrival of rapid transit through the Inlet Rapid Transit Project, that how this residential growth can support the plans that are unfolding with regards to rapid transit on the North Shore. There will be a need to update some of the land use designations in the OCP to allocate based on public and council input the new residential growth that we will be seeing in the district. Affordable housing is a critical issue, and as mentioned earlier, there will be looking to use such tools as inclusionary zoning, density bonus, and rental tenure zoning to help ensure that as much affordable housing as possible is delivered through new development in the community. We'll be looking to modernize some of the OCP policy language to align with some of the existing policy that the district has adopted since the 2011. And finally, Metro Vancouver adopted a new regional growth strategy in February 2023. So the district will also need to develop a new regional context statement to respond to that as part of this project. As Mr. Milburn mentioned, we are being very intentional and very focused in establishing the scope for this project. It is a considerable amount of work. It will take a tremendous amount of resources to deliver on that. And so some consideration was given to what staff would propose not be considered as part of this OCP update. Given the strength of the vision, the success we've had in terms of the urban structure within the current OCP, that was reaffirmed as part of the OCP action plan. Staff are not proposing to revisit the OCP vision and urban structure. Site-specific land use amendments are not being proposed to be considered a part of this. Current applications will continue to be processed, but outside of this process. And finally, technical updates to development permit guidelines will also, our staff are not proposing to include as part of this project. There's a tremendous amount of other existing and ongoing policy work that will certainly influence the OCP update project, and some of the decisions that will be made as part of this will necessitate further policy work and updates to existing policy. Staff want to acknowledge that policy is there and certainly will be considered as part of this project, but cannot, given the timelines and the narrow focus scope that we have for this project, can't guarantee that we will fully integrate all the policy work that has taken place as part of this project. It is worth noting that the legislative changes have also required that we update the OCP every 5 years. So there will be opportunities after this for further work to ensure that the OCP is fully aligned with all the other existing and ongoing policy work that the district is undertaking. Finally, I'd like to present the proposed work plan and timeline. Staff for several last few months have been assessing the legislative changes and working on developing the scope. Many conversations have been taking place amongst the staff team and across departments to ensure that we have the adequate internal resources to deliver this project in the timelines that are required. We will also likely be going out with a request for proposal for additional consulting support to help ensure that the work is done effectively and on time. This fall, or continuing now and through the fall, staff will be working to develop a series of scenarios, land use scenarios, to give a range of possibilities around how we might allocate the residential growth and housing need in the community and the supporting policies. Staff are also intending to return to council in the early fall with a communication plan that'll give more detail around how we would like to communicate on this project and engage with the public and key stakeholders throughout the project to ensure that as much input as possible is incorporated into the project. And finally, the housing needs report will also be presented to council this fall so that we have the 20-year housing need that will be driving this project in the public realm. Staff then intend to come back in early 2025 with draft land use scenarios and policies for council input and seeking support to begin an extensive public engagement process that staff are envisioning to run through the spring of 2025. Intent then would be in the late spring to return to council with a summary of the engagement and propose refinements to the policies and work towards developing bylaws for council consideration and eventual public hearing in order to meet the deadline at the end of December 2025, having updated our OCP and zoning bylaws to accommodate our 20-year housing. Thank you. If you have any questions, staff are here.
Yes. Mr. Stewart, additional comments?
Just one comment. I just want to reemphasize, this isn't a complete review of the OCP. I mean, that would take 3 or 4 years and probably should be done in the next term. What this is tinkering with the OCP to comply with the legislation and updating current plans that we have.
Yeah, I thought about maybe changing the way we view the document to some degree. I mean, if the provincial government wants to use it as a reporting mechanism officially and basically changing the nuts and bolts of it, one thing I mentioned to Mr. Milburn is why don't we break it out into 2 documents, one being the official community vision and the official community plan. The official community plan is the nuts and bolts, the land map, the requirements from the provincial government, and the official community vision is the guidelines and general directions and high-level targets. And that way, when we come up to those reviews, whether it's one mandated by the provincial government, in which case we're affecting the nuts and bolts OCP, and then at council's discretion, they can amend and update the general guidelines and direction. The way that portion of the OCP is used is staff, when a project comes forward, they say this particular project lines up with these key guidelines here, 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 and here. those aren't going to change much over the next generation or so. Maybe they'll tweak and prioritize from time to time. But what the province wants to get into is some very specific amendments and reportable targets embedded into the OCP. And it would seem to me that, when you want the council to have the discussion about it, to meet the provincial mandate, you're only going to be wanting to talk about that portion. Otherwise, you're going to have a fairly large process with everything on the table each time. So it just seemed to me like it's kind of an opportunity to separate the two things out, the things that are general, overarching, longer term visions and goals for the community, and then the stuff that we're trying to use to meet compliance with provincial government. So maybe you can talk about that. Is that something you've considered, or you think that can be achieved within one document? What are your thoughts, Mr. Smith?
Well, I mean, I think in essence, what we're proposing to do in terms of the scope is what you've articulated. We are going to make changes to the OCP document in order to meet the provincial legislative changes. And I think as we move through that process, there will be some tinkering with the policies and the guidelines. But I think as we saw with the OCP action plan, a lot of the higher level picture guidance in terms of our urban structure and vision is in place, and we're not proposing to change that. We're just looking to enhance it and update it given that where we are at in this moment in time.
What I found when we did the 2011 discussion for the document, the moment, I think it was page 17 of the OCP, we put out the growth target. And as soon as the growth target was out, we couldn't talk about anything else. Once that was out there, that was all anybody wanted to talk about. And so here we have an opportunity to sort of move those numbers into a separate piece, and we could have them as separate discussions. Otherwise, once you start talking about a growth target, it'll be very hard to talk to the community about how we become a more healthy community. How do we, achieve all of these other general objectives? So it just became the elephant in the room, and wondering, can you come up with other strategies to try to separate those discussions so that it doesn't become so dominant that we can't have a discussion about the other pieces. But
I mean, I guess at the end of the day, the elephant in the room will be daylighted every 5 years through the housing needs report. We already know through legislation that we'll be doing the housing needs report again in 2028. And as we will see in this fall, that'll be very public what our target is. That will be prescribed. It's not something that will be subject to debate because it is something that's through legislation. So I think, with an effective engagement process, we can have a conversation with council and the community around how we can accommodate that growth moving forward, and not let it necessarily be an albatross, but look at how it aligns with our policies.
Mr. Milner?
Yeah, just having seen communities, often regional districts, multiple OCPs, it can be challenging. They're typically based on geographic areas, right? Different electoral areas. I think what's envisioned is probably one document, because there's actually a list of requirements set out in the Act of what an OCP must include. It's not just housing. There's also servicing and other things.
So it's not those visions and guidelines.
No, that's right. But there's sort of like, but you could write it in a way that's modular, in a sense that here's the portion that deals with this aspect, right? Responding to the provincial need, and then here are the other components. And I think that has some benefits too in terms of naturally focus, for people that are interested in looking at those topics, they can look at it in the document, but also those that recognize there's interrelated implications, like where you put the housing rents directly to transportation, then they can still find those necessary visions and guidance on transportation within the overall document. But you could break it up in a modular way, so it's easy to look up what you're particularly looking for. Overall, it's one document, just because for simplicity and for requirements to meet the provincial requirements.
Yeah, that's fair. I'm just trying to make the distinction between what is our document and what is required by the province. And the reason being, the regional district is a great example of that. When Metro Vancouver was required by the province to bring in an official community plan or a regional growth strategy, as it were, the province said, you must bring this in. But then Metro went and said, sure, but we're going to decide what goes in it, and started putting a whole bunch of stuff under the sun in it, abrogating powers and duties to Metro Vancouver. And then all the municipalities that had to ratify it went, wait a minute, the province said you must have a plan, but the province didn't say that you must cover this, and therefore it really was a very different document than what was prescribed by the province.
So in addition to the recent changes the province made, there is in the Local Government Act a list of what must be in an official community plan. And it's the existing and future land uses, and it lists all of them, including things like aggregates, including things like schools, services, transportation. The things that aren't required but are often included in OCPs are things like social objectives, sort of social policy objectives. Those aren't required, but they're optional, as long as council speak to them at a suitably high level. And the reason is because a lot of local governments end up talking about things like education and healthcare, which are a shared area of responsibility of the province. And so they haven't given council the authority to have policies in those areas. But there is actually a prescribed list in the Act of what must be in the OCP. And for many years, actually a few decades now, housing, affordable special needs and rental housing has been a required content. But what's new is the province has said you have to have 20 years, so that's new. It used to be 5, so 5 to 20. And also that the zoning match whatever it says in the OCP. That's really the new and novel kind of impact that the OCP now has and will have in the future, is it becomes in effect a regulatory document with respect to housing.
No, and that's fair. Not to belabor the point, just to say, it'd be great to be able to see in the document the difference between the statutory requirements and our document. Councilor Muir.
So is the answer yes to that question? We can do that?
I would say, I think, as Mr. Milburn alluded to, there is an inherent structure that is dictated through the legislation in terms of what the document must contain. If you just looked at that as those are the bones of the document, but how we put the muscle and make it our own is up to us. So I think there is a distinction, but I don't think you can create, a standalone document saying this is the part that we must update every 5 years, because there are kind of some interconnected topics. Housing, transportation, climate change, they kind of all are interrelated.
Can we include a table of the number of housing units that have been built since 2010 and the number of affordable units and where that affordability is? We've been talking for nearly 15 years about affordability, and nothing in our community is affordable anymore. Even the rents that were contemplated back when the OCP did not allow restrictions on rentals and stratas, those rents have gone up over the years. And the net loss of truly affordable older housing, that continues. And the number of people that were displaced in that housing and how many of them actually went back in to the housing. I remember during the zoning on a lot of those projects, it was like, oh yeah, we're going to be able to keep track of this. And I wonder if we actually have, to show that what's happened really hasn't improved with that level of affordability. It's made things more expensive. So can we include a page like that so we can truly see where the affordability is? Because I know we have, 10% or 15%. We have all these different equations depending on the programs that we partner with BC Housing, et cetera. But where are those affordability levels? Like we got a comment from a lady today, sent us a letter saying that she's getting evicted because she made $2,700 extra last year because she did some overtime. And so I understand we're looking into that, but it's that kind of thing, right? Like we talk about this crisis, but let's look at how many market units we've built since 2010. Let's look at how many truly affordable units we've built. And let's also look at how many we've lost, how many we've demolished, how many affordable units did we rip down in order to achieve more units, but have they actually resulted in a level of affordability for this community? And how many of those people that were displaced actually got to move into those units and can afford to actually live in them. I think that's gonna say a lot. So this page right here, so we're the dark blue, that's what we've built, and we need to get to the light blue.
Not necessarily.
That was the original plan. And now the province has said you have to have 20 years of another color of blue. And we don't know what, you haven't presented that to us. That's gonna be, right?
Yes, so what that table shows was in the light blue in 2011, what the vision was in terms of the estimated demand at the time was over the next 20 years, we would need to accommodate 10,000 additional homes. And given the urban structure that was created, 75 to 90% of that would be in our 4 key centers. And that's what you see on that table in terms of how we've achieved that in the intervening.
So I guess that what I was just talking about a minute ago, it'd be interesting to see how many of these homes, how many are market, you know, how many are luxury, top floor, you know, top 12 for expensive $1 million homes, market homes, and where the truly affordable housing that we needed to replace when we tore down a lot of the multifamily buildings to make way for this, where they fit in this graph, just so we have an understanding about where we've come from. I think that's really important, because I hear a lot about we're not doing enough, we're not building faster, but a lot of the units that are representative in this graph were held hostage by the development community because they get the zoning, they don't need to move forward. They don't need to build anything. We've seen multiple properties in our OCP and town center sit for many years, be flipped multiple times, and actually change from one kind of housing to another. So I don't really think we understand really where we were, where we are, and where we're going. I think that's still a big confusion. Like if I look on this map, residential for location for residential growth. I mean, even this map is quite outdated, where it identifies Maplewood North, the Innovation District, whatever you want to call it, as industrial. And you know, I do have a significant problem with the province not recognizing land within the boundaries of First Nations that will contribute more significantly than all the municipalities on the North Shore put together in regards to units. Like, think about that for a minute. The Squamish Nation and the Tsleil-Waututh Nation are the biggest developers in the Musqueam in this region right now. And their ability to build on the North Shore will collectively surpass what 3 municipalities are doing right now. And I don't understand why that's not part of this, because the roads are the same, the geography is the same, the infrastructure that we use is the same for all of those units. They don't see boundaries. The units don't see, the people living in them do not see boundaries. And I just can't believe that that is not part of this discussion. Those additions to reserve in the CMAR are significant, and we're identifying it as industrial, but it's actually, it should be like something else, because it's not, we don't know what it is, right? So I have an issue with that. The village centers on this map, like deep, I don't know even what we're thinking about that right now, because in order to replace the existing rentals in Deep Cove, you need significant density to be able to do that, and there's no place to put it. So I'm not sure why we would continue to look at any level of growth in areas like Deep Cove. Could you comment on that?
I mean, I think the intention at this point from staff's perspective is that we utilize the current vision, which is focusing 75 to 90% of growth in our 4 centers and then quarters in between. And then part of the conversation going forward is, how much more can we accommodate in our centers and other alternatives to additional centers beyond the 4 that are identified there, perhaps in some of our corridors. How can we best allocate that growth so that it meets the community's needs, but also fits within the current constraints and parameters as they exist on the ground.
I'll come back.
Okay, I've
Thank
got Councillor Ma, I have to step out. Are you able to take over the chair? And I've got Councillor Hanson next to speak.
Okay.
Mr. Smith, additional comments?
Just if I may, just with regards to First Nations and other stakeholders, that is certainly present in staff's mind in terms of some of the plans that our partners have on the North Shore. And that'll be a critical part of our consultation and engagement plan. Because all those plans, what's happening in the city of North Vancouver, the district and the First Nations, we all need to work together to ensure that, our community, a broader sense of the North Shore functions effectively. So.
And we just need to keep a tally of all that. I think it's really important to tally up all those numbers that we know now and have that so we can show the community. Because we're sort of like acting in a silo, and we have to make sure that we know how many units are in the city, how many units are in West Bend, how many units are on Tsleil-Waututh, et cetera, to understand the scope of what we're talking about. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Councillor Brewer, for your comments. Thanks, Chad, for all the work that's obviously been done on this. I agree with the topics that are listed for the OCP review. One thought that I had is this OCP review is being triggered by Bill 44 and 47. As I understand it, if the department hadn't passed Bill 44 and 47, we wouldn't be contemplating any kind of an OCP review until after the 2026 election. What occurs to me is it's true that we have an obligation to comply with the authority of this provincial government. There's an election coming up in 3 months. And I've lived long enough to know you don't always know who's going to win an election.
Yeah.
Elections sometimes
Surprise you. Surprise you.
Changing government elections. That's why we have this democratic institution. And we don't know if there were a change in government, what the initiatives or priorities of that new government might be, and we would obviously have the same obligation to abide by them as we have to abide by the mandates of this government. So it's just a concern to me. I don't know how much is going to be done in the next 3 months, but I think we do need to be sensitive to that fact that we could find ourselves at the local government, depending on what happens. Agree with everything else that's been said in terms of the priorities. I just emphasize the issue of transportation. I mean, when we talk about growth, what we're going to hear from people in the district is about transportation, about we already don't have enough transportation infrastructure to meet our existing needs. And I was intrigued with the idea of focusing on the potential rapid transit that's coming and the transit stations. I think these types of ideas are going to be very welcome by residents. Also, we're going to be hearing, as we talk about growth, about all other types of infrastructure, schools, hospitals, everything else. And I hope that our plan takes all that into account as we talk about housing and also providing them with infrastructure supports. Those would be my comments for the time being, and thank you for your
work. Thank you very much for the presentation. Thanks for the work so far in laying out the process for this. I'm just curious about the communications piece, which I guess is coming back in the fall, but how that's going to compare to our OCP review that led to the action plan, and if it's going to be a similar kind of approach or more detailed, more like the OCP process where we had charrettes and that type of thing, or it's going to be more like the review.
I mean, I think it'll be its own thing, but I think kind of currently the central formation of the engagement that certainly from the planning side is this development of scenarios. So coming forward to council and the public to engage on a range of scenarios around how we could allocate the 20-year housing need. So something that's very visual and people can wrestle with some of the trade-offs that you need to make in terms of how you allocate residential growth. So I think that will be kind of a central focus for the engagement process to help people understand and perhaps with some visual components see what the different choices and trade-offs are in terms of how we allocate growth. Certainly there'll be a need to work with the neighboring communities and First Nations around some of their plans. The district of this West Vancouver and the city of North Vancouver are having the same requirements as us, so they will be going through the same process on the same timelines. So there'll certainly be a need to coordinate there.
I would just say generally, I think the way we conducted the engagement through the OCP action plan and OCP review last time was well received. I think people did appreciate the way we went about it. So that's good to hear. I also agree with 7 key focus areas. It is very much focused on housing and where we had to put growth and understand what's driving that. But I hope that we'll be able to talk to residents about other things that they, maybe want to see as time goes on and the different neighborhoods evolve. Things that maybe they think their community is missing as far as the types of businesses that are there or types of events, things that make it feel like a happening place. And that they want to live in and a connected neighborhood. Glad to hear that we're going to be working closely with TWN and Squamish as stakeholders in this. I feel like that's been missing very much in the last time we've gone through this type of process. And yet, as Councilor Murray has highlighted, they're the biggest developers in the region. I just think if the province, I understand that the province isn't recognizing it in terms of the housing units that they're building as part of our plans, but I think it's critical that we try to work and plan together as much as we can. And then I totally agree with Councillor Hanson's comments around the links to transportation throughout all of this, and I think that's going to be an important part of the discussion as well.
Oh, sorry, just wanted to add, just in response to the question, we'll actually be looking for a very specific resolution from council in the fall. And that resolution will specify who to consult, how often, and by what method. So it's a requirement whenever you do an official community plan update, you start the process that we receive that direction. So we'll give you some advice that'll come from our communications team and our community planning team. But we'll be looking for your specific direction on the mechanics and how we do that. I do have to say that our normal large policy processes are iterative. So we start with vision and we work towards further refinement, and that takes time. We will not have the luxury of time in this particular round. It will need to be a focused conversation, and that may constrain somewhat the tactics that we use, but we'll give you some advice on that in the fall.
So also to your question about communications, at this point in our early conversations, we're sort of seeing 3 streams, is how I would characterize it. So we've got the partner and stakeholder consultation work, which is a lot of what we did last time as well. But because others were not working on updating their OCP at the same time, they weren't as invested in it was more information out rather than perhaps a more collective conversation. Because this is what's been mandated by the province and everybody's going to be working with this, I think that partner and stakeholder conversation will be different than it has been in the past. As well as Mr. Smith talked about the development scenarios and that sort of thing for the communities. And then what we saw worked quite well in what we call our FIFO work. So the work that we recently finished.
What's the acronym?
What were we calling it publicly?
It was just the team looking after the provincial housing initiative response initially to Bill 44, so the small scale multifamily housing in the transit oriented areas. Yeah. So we had some targeted work.
Yeah, we had some targeted work that we did as an outreach to the community because of course council had asked us to do that. And that turned into quite a civic literacy exercise that people really quite enjoyed. And so that's the kind of thing that we've also been talking about through this context. I think that it's fair to say that there will be some in the community that will also be surprised that we're back again so soon to talk about an OC. And they're used to seeing it through a very different lens. And so I think that there's going to be some education needed there about why this is different and what's driving us to come back to them so quickly on this, because they weren't expecting it. Well, none of us were. I think it's true.
Thank you very much. Let's stop looking at what we've done since 2011. That was 14 years ago. And that data is irrelevant to what's going on today. The world has changed. We all know we have a housing crisis, and a lot of this was addressed in the OCP action plan in 2021. But in the next OCP, I would like to see a greater focus on the urgency needed for affordability. I would like to see it in detail to include where we would like to see modular housing or supportive housing or transitional housing, the things that are essential to this community in the coming decade. And I also agree with the comments made by Councillor Back. It is critical for us to have a very robust community engagement process. Glad to hear that we'll be looking at who to consult and how often, because the very makeup of this community has changed dramatically in the last decade. And we have, for example, a very large Persian population now that wasn't involved at all in the previous extensive community engagement process. And just as a side note, I met today with a large group of seniors from the Persian community, along with Councillor Back. There were about 80 people there. And I asked them, who is concerned in this room about affordable housing in North Van? Every single person put up their hand. So again, we just keep getting told this over and over and over again. And yet, so much of our documentation does not have the urgency underlined in it. And so that is what I would like to see going forward. I'd like to see more surveys online with specific questions. Do you want to provide more housing in your neighborhood? Are you expecting your children or your aging parents to stay in the community? If so, how? What would you be willing to accept in your community to meet the needs of your needs and your family's needs and the community going forward? Of course, transportation issues are also key. And as Councillor Back said, I would like to see also more focus on the activation of town centers that certainly many other communities are progressing at a rapid pace to meet that desire of the community to be outside, be gathering and connecting with other community members.
I'm just gonna go first, first next speaker, and I'll come back to you. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Great, thank you. First of all, thank you to staff for this talk. I know it's especially busy time for any staff working on anything related to housing. I just want to touch on the scope of this update. I understand that the recent legislation introduction focuses on housing. I appreciate the tight timelines to get our bylaws in alignment by December 2025. And I acknowledge your comments earlier about what's out of scope during this update. However, as many other members of council have alluded to, there are many interrelated issues that housing affects. You know, this was part of a pushback that we had with the housing claim. It's not just housing, it's infrastructure, it's roads, it's our pipes and everything. I'm just wondering, when you come back, I'm hoping that council is looking at things more than this, having plan for housing, while considering the impacts of that. I'm thinking about the impact on employment plans, make trade-offs and the amount of land that we try to maintain for light industrial use, especially in the Maplewood area where that's, we have a couple of proposals coming forward on that. So I'm just trying to understand this update. Is it gonna at least touch on some of these issues, or is that out of scope?
I mean, I will speak candidly is that like at some point there'll be a myriad of different issues that people will want to latch on to that because they're all to some extent interconnected. So I think what staff are trying to propose in terms of a scope is and we have to be very intentional and very focused in terms of how we move forward because we have very, very tight timelines that we have to meet. And so our ability to address all the interconnected and interrelated issues, we will not necessarily be able to do that as fulsomely as we'd like. But again, we acknowledge that we will be able to continue work once we've addressed kind of the legislative requirements to keep going on addressing, issues around light industrial, further implementation of the economic development strategy. There's a whole host of other things we would like to incorporate into the OCP in time. But again, I think we need to be very intentional and focused in terms of what we take on as part of this project. It's not to say that we will ignore those issues. Certainly we acknowledge them, but again, we just need to be very focused and intentional around the 20-year housing need and allocating that.
Cheers. So I just also wanted to bring to council's awareness that a number of councils have brought forward the concept of transportation, which falls within infrastructure services. We as staff have had discussions in terms of, this is a really critical piece of work that has a really strict timeline. The last thing we want to be doing is having ancillary pieces overwhelming this process that jeopardizes us actually getting to our end goal. That being said, what we're planning as staff to do is after the summer break is to coming back to council to initiate that discussion about our transportation plan and the concept of looking at that. And then once we identify what the engagement strategy is for this piece of work, are there opportunities for us to piggyback on it without overwhelming it? That could be difficult, or having a parallel separate process to talk about transportation as well. I know it's something that council has had an interest in talking about. We've had some resourcing challenges because of the recent provincial housing work, but I think after the summer break is a good time for us to initiate the discussion with council as it relates to transportation of itself, and we'll be informed through this work as well from discussions. Yeah.
It's good to hear that the different areas are recognizing the priority.
Yeah,
that there's.
Thank you, Acting Chair Ma. Thanks, Mr. Cohen. I would also just want to reference that the Local Government Act tells us what we have to look at, and it also does include water, roads, sewers, for example. So we know when we start to develop the scenarios, once we know what our 20-year growth numbers are, where could those be allocated? How can they be serviced and accessed? Those are essential parts, mandatory parts to consider. Some areas, as was mentioned earlier by Mr. Milburn, we may look at, but we tend to want to do that anyhow. The employment lands piece is also, we know, important. That was a focus of the OCP action plan. We also are constrained by time and constrained by the mandates before us. So as has been said, a fulsome look at all of the pieces will not be done. A look at what we must do will be done. And it's highly envisioned by at least staff around the table that there will be a set of pieces of work that follow upon the adoption of the OCP. And some of those likely would be changes to some of the town and village center plans, for example, as has been mentioned. Thank you.
It's not one more comment. From recent meetings, I believe there's interest by this council to look at multiplex options, especially triplexes. I also believe there's interest in examining the possibility of increasing FSR or relaxing regulations around coach houses. I think we need to do more to encourage soft densification. Could these be part of that OCP update? And if so, does it fit in?
I would say yes on a high level. So in terms of giving consideration of further infill development possibilities as a way to accommodate our 20-year housing need. certainly will be part of the consideration in terms of our scenario development. Getting into the specifics around FSR for coach houses or something like that, that might need to be a separate piece of work. Just given, again, the time and focus that we need to have in terms of meeting the legislative requirements.
I'll come back to that at a later time.
Okay.
Thank you. So, so basically this 7 focus areas, they're all really connected to the legislation and having to update the OCP in order to concur with the legislation. And it's about trying to fit whatever that 20-year housing need is into the OCP. So if you were to look at the transit-oriented centers, the 8 to 12 stories, I'm just curious, like, what kind of number are we talking here in this 20-year needs assessment? What's Mr. Milburn?
Through the chair, we're estimating it's going to be in the range, and we don't know the exact number that's to come, but based on previous analysis the province generated as part of the housing targets, we estimated in the 15 to 20,000 plus range of new housing units over 20 years. And we won't be recommending simply that, for example, would be addressed with the coach house amendments council just made.
Well, of course,
council added 17,000. So similarly, we take that same kind of approach for the TOAs. We're going to be thinking about what is practically could be developed within those areas, not necessarily what's the maximum theoretical capacity, despite hazards and access and so on. We're going to try to come back with practical advice because we want to make sure that whatever financial strategies we come up with and whatever servicing strategies, there's some logical extension of services and connection with transportation, and then we have it backed by a strategy. And so it's complex because it's like you say, the comparison of what's there with what could be over the next 20 years.
And what would be realized, and I think this is why it's really important to go back to what we've already done, because the intention of the OCP was to create a diverse set of housing units, was to protect employment, was to protect the environment, was to create a sustainable community. And we really, in the last 15 years, gentrified the North Shore. It was quite a different community 15, 20 years ago. West Van was where you did well if you were in the market. The city was where you got your first rental apartment when you were working at the bank, and then the district was a bit of both. And now we're generally going along. I mean, it's actually, even if you look on the rental units, it's a bit cheaper to live in West Van right now. Go figure. Who would ever thought that? I look at Queensdale on that map, and there's a number of multifamily older units up in Queensdale. We've recently lost 3 blocks of affordable housing that sit in the upper parts of the city of North Vancouver. They were once older, very affordable units. One had a fire, so it was replaced, but it was replaced with market rental units. And one recently just came down and one's finished, but they're all market units. And so you got to ask yourself, if you're trying to build affordable housing, what did you take down and what did you get in return? It's like the idea of this, we need to put in information because we've got to speed things up. But I think it's really important for staff to explain how that works, because do we have tools to speed things up? Do we have tools to force the private sector to build units? They build based on the economics of a project. And we plan based on creating a sustainable community. And like right now, I hear TransLink needs funding. They've run out of money. There's no sustainable level of money coming from senior levels of government. They're gonna have to start cutting their services. They've cut 100 million, 35 positions in their, in the organization, just to be able to keep their head above the water. Like, we cannot just fit in another 20,000 units without understanding what kind of units they are, how affordable they are, where the transit's gonna come from, how we're going to replace the infrastructure, where the schools are gonna be. It is inconceivable to me that we are walking down this road, and I get that you're being told to do this. I just think it sucks. It sucks. Because doing this in isolation of everything else is not sustainable. And that's not what this plan was built on, and that's not what this community was built on. And I think it's gonna bite us so hard. And I don't think we're going to achieve what we're trying to achieve. We've seen Coquitlam do this, and we know the numbers in Coquitlam, 240 units, 4 full-time planners, to achieve what? Nothing. 0 compared to what we were able to achieve before. I think we're already kind of bursting. And when our schools are all full and the province needs 5 years just to get to a point where they can say, okay, now we've planned, now we know what we need, now we'd like the money to build the school. It's 10 years, if we even get the school. In comparison, you know, competing with all other municipalities around the region for the same thing. You know, I was talking to a city mayor today that builds, you know, constant development. And as from their perspective, pencils are down right now. You know, projects are on hold. They're not moving forward. It's slowing down. It's not speeding up. So you know, so 15 to 20,000 units, I'm wondering, just out of curiosity, we have to have the areas identified to be able to accommodate that number. Okay, so let's do some math on these transit-oriented centers. Is that it? Does that cover it, maybe? You know, some of those areas are quite big. If we're putting more density in here, I don't know why we're gonna spread it out. I think the density should be concentrated in the town centers. And if the density needs to go up in order to accommodate this wish that the province has to solve this problem based on speculation, then that density has to sit within those town centers, because we cannot encourage sprawl throughout this area, because we quite frankly can't afford it. We can't get transit right now to the Seymour, and now it's gonna be cut, and we're gonna put more people in there. Plus, we've already got a First Nation that could build literally thousands of units on land we have no control over. So I get that it's complex. Do you just like pull what's left of your hair out, going to planning school for all those years and then being thrown this frickin' rocket? I think it's just crazy. Anyway, we shall see. Best laid plans of mice and men. I like that term.
At this time, I'm gonna give the public an opportunity to speak. Clerk? Anyone online register to speak?
We have no individuals registered to speak.
Anyone present that would like to speak?
I don't have anything in particular. I prefer to email my input, but I did want to bring up something in Mr. Smith's report that wasn't touched on because it's likely not that key, but just that your regional contact statement will be pushed out a little bit longer than it was anticipated to be done, just as a result of a need to redo the OCP, I think. Is that right? Is that what your report mentioned, that the regional contact statement would be delayed?
Yes, I mean, certainly when a regional growth strategy is adopted, you typically have 2 years to submit a revised regional contact statement to respond to that. So normally we would, in normal times, would have had an RCS, regional contact statement, done for February 2025. We've had extensive conversations at the staff level with Metro Vancouver, and they're certainly aware of the issue and the pressure that all local governments are under. So they are recognizing that, you know, it would be kind of unrealistic to expect everybody to meet that deadline. Certainly at the staff level, open to accommodating what many jurisdictions are doing similar to us, is that they're incorporating it as part of this OCP update process for the end of 2025.
One other thing, and this is very specific when it comes to your pondering growth, more growth in the town centers that have even already developed, would be a policy in municipal rebuilds such as Ron Andrews and other like Karen Magnuson and stuff, perhaps considering housing in those. I had sent an email last year about maybe council making a policy about those older buildings, even in Edgemont at the library there, when those are up for rebuilding, that maybe you should be considering putting that affordable housing on your land there. So that's beyond the scope of this probably, but just a chance to say that. Thank you.
Thanks for putting it on the table.
On that point, being on the library board, we did look at that, and if we were to get a support for the library, housing would definitely be part of it. So there's a lot of different groups talking about it, Kelly, so
Good.
it's on the radar.
Excellent. Thank you.
And I have Councillor Pope for a second time.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Back to Mayor Vaughn. Just a couple of quick questions, really. The housing needs report, and there's the new UBCM tools. Are we going to make use of that free service?
Certainly, UBC has partnered with the province to develop a calculator, and so I think later this month they'll be releasing that publicly. And we certainly, I know one of our staff members is participating in a webinar looking at that tool, so we certainly will be using that. We have already engaged a consultant and are actively working to respond to the provincial guidance around developing the housing needs report. So we'll likely be looking at initial numbers later this summer. So work is well underway to make sure that we have a very solid update to our housing needs report.
Thank you. Also, in your other scope detail, there is the technical updates to development permit guidelines. Can you elaborate on that, please?
The district has a series of development permit areas such as wildfire, steep slopes, environmental protection, streamside protection, and all have associated guidelines around outlining what you can and can't do in terms of development to respond to those hazards. So there is an outstanding desire to kind of update some of those guidelines to make sure that they reflect the latest thinking and best practices in terms of how we respond to those hazards. That is important work, but something that we're not going to address as part of this project.
Was that not updated recently when we were having a discussion about the provincial government housing legislation surrounding SMO? Those maps that we saw, was that not part of it?
Thank you, through the chair. So the discussion was that if the exempt areas were defined, SMO was applied, then the provincial regulation required council's consideration of whether or not to apply hazard areas. And the conversation was that if those hazard areas were applied, that there would be likely some benefit to updating the hazard reports and so on that justified them to respond to whether or not increasing density could be accommodated, even within the hazard area defined. So it was kind of tied to the small scale multifamily housing outcome at the time. I don't know if you want to add to that.
Yeah, sure. Just to add to kind of what Dan's sharing there, I think it's also important, and there's probably a number of factors here, but thinking about Steep Creeks as an example of a hazard area, we're already doing some work to just recheck we're following industry best practice in some of these hazard areas. That takes a lot of time and a lot of energy of technical work. It's just not going to work with the timelines that this planning team needs. So it is still working behind the scenes, but in terms of coupling it with the OCP, it's just not going to be happening.
And one of the keys to affordability is also being able to speed up development approval processes. I believe that we were supposed to have a report this spring from the consultant who was going to provide us with some quick wins in ways that this process could be speeded up. So I'm disappointed that we haven't heard from that consultant yet. And I'm wondering where the process is at and how soon we can expect to see some of those recommendations that he's been working on for the last year implemented. Mr. Milburn.
Through the chair, we have a report on the next agenda, which is the interim report from the consultant on phase 1. Their complete report will be coming just after the summer break. And in the report, you'll see next week, we'll highlight a lot of those quick wins and things that we are moving forward implementing. So you'll see quite a detailed table on the various actions that are being undertaken. And that will hopefully answer all the questions I think you're raising, but we're happy to go into detail at that time. So it's next Monday.
Great, thank you very much.
Okay, I think we've had a pretty fulsome discussion. I'm looking around the room, any more hands up?
Acting Mayor Moore, I have one more comment that just came to me. When Councillor Murray was talking about the First Nations units and so on, correct me if I'm wrong, when the housing order came down, I swear I read something in the letter from the province, from Minister Callan, that said Mayor Little had asked for an exemption that our, maybe I'm dreaming this, that our total units include include the units that were pondered on the First Nations land?
So the Housing Supply Act specifically excluded Indigenous lands. We identified that as a concern as we have service agreements. And so the interrelated issues around servicing and access to transportation are fundamental to how we see development occurring in our community. And we didn't appreciate the detachment in the act of those two issues. And we asked for some consideration of that at the time.
And they didn't consider it. Thank you.
Okay, why would we do that? On that note,
We have adjournment.
we need to.
Through the chair, it's at council's discretion. It's just a receipt motion, so.
Receipt.
So I'm gonna move that the report titled Official Committee Plan Update Full Scope dated June 24th be received for information. Do I have a second there? Put it to vote. All in favor? Contrary? Pass.
Move adjournment.
I have it.
Wasn't it me also recommending? Second? They were both recommending. Sorry.
Just to receive information.
Just received.
It's just received.
That was the only one.
Yeah.
Just received.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you very much.